everyone, I'm Dr. Duke. Welcome to part 2 of the socialist destruction of education. In part 1, we took a very, interesting look at the origin of educational philosophy through socialist lenses. We started with Karl Marx. We talked how the Bolsheviks then took Marx's ideas and radicalized them. We looked at Lenin and Stalin. Then we pointed out, too, that Hitler and Mussolini, the fascists, who have way more in common with each other educationally than they certainly do Western notions of education or traditional American notions of education, looked at how they, too, took exactly the same aim and exactly the same path educationally that the actual communists did. There's nothing that distinguishes, really, a Nazi, a fascist, and a communist and a Bolshevik in terms of the educational aims of how you bring children on board. You force them into a worldview that, remember, as Gramsci said, socialism is the religion that must replace Christianity. In order to turn kids into full-blown socialist Marxist communists, you have to eradicate the idea of God and replace it with the state, elevating the state to the level of God. And if you've been paying any attention to the Dr. Duke Show, you will know that that movement is well afoot in American education. Want to move a little bit forward now. Let's talk about education in America specifically, and let's talk about John Dewey. We mentioned how, many people have mentioned how the American public school system, we didn't have a public school system in this country until about 1850. The Founding Fathers made no provision whatsoever for public schools because they knew if you put the state in charge of educating children, inevitably the state would begin to educate children for their own benefit and not for the benefit of anybody else. They would not be interested in educating kids to be holistic or entrepreneurial or independent or self-sufficient. The state would begin to educate kids to propagate the propaganda of the state, and that's what socialist education is. And so Horace Mann, the founder of American public schools, he actually referred to American public school kids as hostages. Your children will become hostages to our educational system, he said in the 1850s, right? Your children will be mandated, just what Marx said in the previous lecture, right? That schools will become mandatory, they will be paid for mandatorily by the state. That's exactly the system that Horace Mann envisioned as well. Your children, he said, will become hostages to our sacred cause of education. Again, notice that Mann called it sacred, our sacred cause of education. Because Gramsci was right. In order to get people to buy in fully to socialist inventing of everything, you have to make it quasi-religious. Perhaps the single most damning socialist in terms of American education. The man who, more than anything else, took huge leaps in turning American public schools into socialist incubation experiments would be John Dewey. John Dewey was actually a communist. He was not a pretend communist. He actually flew to the Soviet Union after the Bolsheviks took power, wanted to see how things worked. He was in every way, shape, and form a purveyor of the kind of communist socialist education that your kids are getting now. In fact, he may be the first really dangerous, evil voice we can point to in the history of this. He says in his own educational philosophy, in his book, Democracy and Education, which again ties together something we said in part 1. Democracy is necessary for socialism. When John Dewey writes Democracy and Education, he's mimicking Karl Marx. He is recognizing the way that through democratic ideas, the ideas of democracy, not constitutional republics, not representative government, no. He means simple democracy. Through democracy, with education, you can reshape the minds of children towards socialism. It's amazing how utterly consistent this is. There's nothing foggy about this. There's nothing tinfoil hat about this. You just go back and look at what these fascists and Bolsheviks have said, going back to Marx, and then you jump forward to somebody like Dewey. He's ticking all the same boxes. He titles his book Democracy and Education because he realizes that it is through the misunderstandings of democracy, through popular uneducated sentiment, you can use education to transform people away from liberty and freedom. He said, we're all teachers and instructors to realize that the quality of mental process, not the production of correct answers, is the measure of educative growth, something hardly less than a revolution in teaching would be worked. If we could get teachers to believe that their primary function is not to impart knowledge, not to dispassionately teach kids things, right? To add, to multiply, to read. If we can convince teachers to recognize that that's not what their education's about. It's about controlling mental processes, reshaping children through ideology. Let me reread this quote again because it's a damning one. We're all teachers to realize, if only all teachers realized, that the quality of mental process, not the production of correct answers, is the measure we should use to measure education growth, a revolution would be worked in teaching. Think about the degree to which modern teachers are first and foremost sociologists without sociological training. They are psychologists without psychological backgrounds. They are ideological enforcers of a new orthodoxy without having any political science bona fides. These are four-year teachers, for God's sake. I teach teachers at my university. They are not a four-year degree in education is as worthless of a degree intellectually as any you could possibly get. Why? Because in math, you have to study math. In English, you have to learn how to read and write. In science, you have to study chemistry and periodical tables. In education, there's really nothing there but ed philosophy. In other words, the whole education part of education major is nothing more than just theory, right? Ideological, and in this case, radical left-wing socialist theorizing. Again, when the big education schools on your colleges, they want to teach your kid to be a teacher, right? Your daughter wants to be a high school teacher. They send them to a high school English teacher. They send them to English professors to teach them the English part of the curriculum. Your son wants to be a middle school math teacher. They send him to math professors to learn the math, and then they go back to the education program. So half their credits in their education major comes from all of these repetitive, multicultural, left-wing, ideologically socialist education theories of the last 40, 50, 60, 78 years, going all the way back to Dewey. And it starts with this. Teacher's job is not to teach your kids to be smarter, to know things. A teacher's job is to manipulate the mental processes of the students to turn them into the kind of students that social progressives want. Welcome to social justice education in America. That's what you're getting now. Further, in Democracy and Education, Dewey writes, mind as a concrete thing is precisely the power to understand things in terms of the use made of them. This is utilitarianism, right? Let me boil this down. What's good for the many is good for the few. This is democracy as stepping stone to socialism. We got to get our teachers to believe, our schools to believe, that the mind is a concrete thing, is the power of the mind to see things in terms of their utter utility. What ultimately good is something? Not the value of a thing, but what pragmatic use it could be turned to. A socialized mind, he says, a socialized, as in socialism, a socialized mind is the power to understand them in terms of the use to which they are turned in joint or shared situations. The purpose of a socialist mind is to understand the utility of communes, right? Collectives. We have to realize that the individual is nothing in the face of the collective. That's what he just said. And the mind, in this sense, is the method of social control. If the best way to get kids to become collectivists and to reject individuality is to socialistically train their minds, then education, controlling the mind, is the method of social control. The purpose of this kind of ideology is to control your kids. That's what your public schools are doing now. They're retraining them. They're breaking them of the morality and the religion and the patriotism you've tried to instill in them as children. They're taking that from them and making them think collectively, making them anti-individual. Let me read that quote again. Mind as a concrete thing is precisely the power to understand things in terms of their utility to the socialist cause. A socialized mind is the power to understand ideas in terms of the use to which they are turned in joint or shared, i.e. collective situations. And mind, in this sense, is the way we control those kids. Of course, to the surprise of nobody, Dewey was one of the most famous and high-profile creators of the Humanist Manifesto in America in 1933. It was an international movement, but make no doubt about it, American progressive socialists were the ones who had as much of a responsibility for this as anybody else. Dewey, 1933, that's roughly the rise of fascist Germany, right? That's the year that Hitler took power. All these things are happening at this time. Margaret Sanger and her Planned Parenthood founder with her eugenicist, we need free and ample abortion to get rid of all those pesky brown and black skinned babies. Right during this period, this is the great period where you had Nazi sympathizers in America as well. People like John D. Rockefeller, who was a major funder for the investigations of John Dewey. Here's the opening statement of the Communist Manifesto. Humanism, which is going to replace God, it's going to replace liberty, it's going to replace everything that traditional American values. Humanism asserts that the nature of the universe depicted by modern science makes unacceptable any supernatural or cosmic guarantees of human values. In other words, our materialistic scientific understanding of the universe, our godless, atheist, materialist worldview makes it impossible for us to take seriously or to even allow any supernatural explanations for human values. In other words, right there is the undermining of our Constitution. Our rights and our freedoms do not come from the Creator, a supernatural cosmic guarantee. Our rights no longer come from a Creator, says John Dewey and his Socialists. It comes from nature. Nature must be controlled by men. Men control nature through government, i.e. socialism is the answer. Humanism asserts that the nature of the universe depicted by modern science makes unacceptable any supernatural or cosmic guarantees of human values. Human values are simply that. They are social constructs. There is no transcendence here. There are no absolutes here. Everything is being deconstructed as early as 1933. Obviously, the manifesto goes on. Obviously, humanism does not deny the possibility of realities as yet undiscovered, but it does insist that the way to determine the existence and value of any and all reality is by the means of intelligent inquiry and by the assessment of their relations to human needs. Right? Utilitarianism again, right? Forget God, forget heaven. The Christian idea that a life of love and mercy and justice and sacrifice here will entail you, will prepare you for an eternal heaven with a just God must be done away with. We must no longer, the manifesto says, see the earth as but a step toward eternity. We must recognize, says the atheist, that the earth is all. So let us turn the earth into a Garden of Eden. And that's why the socialists have had to kill so many people. What the socialists think they're handing people, and in this case, there's almost no distinction between what a humanist and a socialist would argue. They are exactly the same thing, as we've already seen in the first part, and you will see moving forward. You can't draw a meaningful difference between humanism, as it's described here, and socialism. Get rid of God, use the power of education to change the minds, not educate, to change the minds, to brainwash kids, to get this kind of outlook. What it says here at the end is really shocking. Religion must formulate its hopes and plans in the light of the scientific spirit and method. We will only allow religion to exist if it actually becomes a religion of materialism, religifying people to become atheist materialists. That's the new religion, right? Remember what Gramsci said. Socialism will be the religion that replaces Christianity. And the humanists in 1933, again, Hitler, who also we saw as a good socialist, right? Making these same arguments in Nazi Germany. This is the exact same argument that Dewey makes that gave us the Hitler Jugend. And there is no way you can distinguish between the two ideas. It's the exact same philosophy of educational religion. Further in the Humanist Manifesto, in the place of the old attitudes involved in worship and prayer, the humanist finds his religious emotions expressed in a heightened sense of personal life and in a cooperative effort to promote social well-being. This is very, very sly. We are not getting rid of religion. we are turning religion into a materialist mythology, right? A mythology without God, without actual values, without transcendent heaven or hell, without the idea of ultimate justice. We're going to turn your religion into a ideology that serves our status ambitions. In the place of these old attitudes that involved worshiping a God and praying to a God, the humanist will find his religious emotions expressed merely in a heightened sense of personal life, i.e., right, a greater social consciousness. This is the first iteration of Western culture, of being woke. You think about what being woke means, right? It means being mindlessly, religiously, politically correct. It means denying even science, which they herald here, if science contradicts the reality of what the socialist wants, right? There you have the foundation of the term woke, and you have the foundation, my friends, of socialist education, right? Promote social well-being. Wokeness and social justiceness is evinced right here in 1933 for really the first time in American history. Humanist Manifesto continues. Man will learn to face the crises of life in terms of his knowledge of their naturalness and probability. In other words, we will see death and suffering. We will see genocide and abortion, for that matter, simply as aspects of nature. In nature, animals destroy their children all the time. Babies are eaten by certain animals. In the animal kingdom, there is no real love. It's all instinct, right? Same thing there, but you go back to this. The crisis of life in terms of naturalness, right? Death itself is natural. It's the natural end of things. There's nothing beyond it. We will teach men to face the crises of life in terms of knowledge of their naturalness and probability. Everyone's going to die, probably, right? And look, as Lenin said, if you want to make an omelet, you got to break a few eggs. Naturalness and probability, right? If you got 200 million people living in your country and 50 million of them aren't getting on the program to become good little naturalist, atheist, religious believers, well, then maybe you starve them to death, as millions were starved to death in the Ukraine, right? That's probability, right? That's utility. That's utilitarianism. If you got to kill 10 to make 100 happy, if you got to kill 1 million to make 1 billion happy, then you got to do it, right? Reasonable and manly attitudes will be fostered by education and supported by custom. And what they mean by manly education here is deterministic, nihilistic education, right? Death is the end. Sometimes you got to kill. Sometimes you got to break a few eggs to make those omelets, right? Be a man about this. And again, this is exactly the same time Hitler and the Bolsheviks were both in their countries employing this the same kind of methodology, right? Be a man about the fact that the Jews are inferior. Be a man about the naturalistic fact that the probability shows us, that our own scientific research shows us that certain races are inferior. Be a man and do what you have to do in the natural sense, right? What happens to the weak in the animal kingdom? In Darwinism, they get eaten up and swallowed away, right? The herd is naturally culled. Along came Christian civilization with its weakness, right? What did Jesus, the alpha cuck, right? What did Jesus have to say? Jesus said, love the suffering, love the poor. Don't you see, the socialist says, how that gets in the way? If we spend all our time loving the sick and the suffering and the dying and putting their needs above ours, well, then we're not pursuing the social natural order where the weak are eradicated by nature. Along comes Hitler, along comes the Humanist Manifesto, along comes the Bolsheviks, and all of a sudden what? We're culling the species, right? The retarded, the Eastern European, those that in any way, shape, or form can be branded the gay and the lesbian. We can pick them out and exterminate them, because that's what natural probability is, right? If it weren't for your wishy-washy Christianity with its love thy neighbor garbage, we would live in a more Darwinian world. The manifesto continues. We assume that humanism will take the path of social and mental hygiene. Nurse Ratched, anybody? This is One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest in its nascence, right? We assume that humanism will take the path of social and mental hygiene and discourage sentimental and unreal hopes and wishful thinking. Hopes about freedom and love and actuality and God and heaven, all those dreamy things. And that word mental hygiene, it should give you quivers. It's 1984, it's Brave New World, right? It's this idea of mental hygiene. They're using education to practice mental hygiene on your kids. What that means is they are going to scrub away, right? Think about Nurse Ratched with your kid in a headlock. They're going to scrub away all those ideas of individual worth and value and sacrifice and Christian love. We're going to scour those away. And if the scouring of education doesn't work, then we're going to give you a pill, right? Then we're going to give you an injection. Then we're going to anti-God you. We're going to give you an anti-God vaccine, right? Whatever we have to do to scrub you into mental hygiene for this brave new world that's coming, that we will do. Further, did you know there was a second iteration of the Humanist Manifesto in 1973? A number of progressive socialists decided it wasn't enough. We have to go ahead on the 40th anniversary and redo it. They actually did it again, I believe, in 2003, which was kind of a more tepid effort. Here's a couple of statements from the 1973 version so we can see. When you think about what happened to American public schools between 1933 and 1973, and you should be terribly, terribly frightened, right? And then you think about what's going to happen between 1973 and 2013 in American public schools, you see this exact plan being followed to a T. The Humanist Manifesto number 2, second iteration, 1973. We deplore the division of humankind on nationalistic grounds. The Open Borders Brigade, right? We have reached the point 40 years later where they're now calling for the disintegration of borders, disintegration of nation states. They're already calling for one world collective government, right? We deplore the division of humankind on nationalistic grounds. We have reached a turning point in human history where the best option is to transcend the limits of national sovereignty and to move toward the building of a world community in which all sectors of the human family can participate, right? All sectors of the human family. One government, right? And you know that one government is by definition not going to be a constitutional republic. It's not even going to be a pure democracy. And what are you beginning to see what separates a pure democracy, a pure mob rule from a socialist mob rule? The mob rule under socialism is controlled by the Politburo, right? That imagine an anarchistic form of democracy, which is that's what it is. Whoever has the strongest win. Whoever has the most win. Whoever can create the biggest mob wins. Take that and then put a very small handful of oligarchs in charge of that, right? Socialist oligarchs in charge of that. And you have how democracy gives way to socialism, gives way to communism. The 73 statement continues. We're going to transcend the limits of national sovereignty and move to the building of a world community in which all sectors of the human family can participate. This is on the lips of every single Democrat candidate. This is on the lips of all graduating college juniors and seniors now. These kids can't read and can barely write at high school levels, but they're talking to you about this stuff. They despise their country. They assume the non-Western countries of the world are morally superior in their poverty and in their fascism. That these must be the ways we follow things. Thus, we look to the development of a system of world law and world order, and guess what that also means? World education. Remember, Common Core was not created by its creators simply to be an American phenomenon. It was meant to be a step towards a form of global education, right? That's why aspects of Common Core education have been exported to other countries outside of the West. This is the job, right? The job is to create not a better education system, not even a terribly functional one, but to create a universal one. The argument of Common Core was the word common. We will have every student in this country getting the same kind of education. And to do that, by definition, it has to be a lower education. You cannot, every time you raise a standard or you push kids a little harder, kids fall off. That's not common. We need a lowest common denominator education. And by the way, Think about how bad your schools now are in America, and think about how much worse they'll be, not better, when you link American schools up to some global consortium of education. Then you'll have to even lower the standards for all of those non-21st century cultures who haven't even begun to figure out how to give their kids a basic education. So you're going to have to lower it even further. That's the object here. But socialism, this kind of religion, does not require an educated people. The founders said the American experiment requires an educated and a moral populace. And they go, the Humanist Manifesto of 1973 goes on, thus we look to the development of a system of world law and world order based upon a transnational federal government. Transnational. This is hope and change, guys, on a global scale, right? We are going to fundamentally transform the nature of government in the world. This is what young Greta, again, to go back to her, young Greta Thunberg, that blunt tool that shows you the consequences of socialist education. You scratch the surface of her climate change ranting, and you've got the very clear argument that we are anti-capitalism, we are anti-free markets, we are anti-modernity, anti-liberty, anti-individuality. She's actually came forth and said it now, right? That really what we have to do is get rid of those things. It's not even really about the environment. The manifesto continues. We, in 1973, we affirm that moral values derive their source only from human experience. Do you understand the wicked danger of that, right? That moral values that don't take into account those kinds of relationships, right? They have that default to some kind of code of behavior or commandments or divine or revelation or scriptural texts. No. Moral values must derive their sources merely from human experiences. Ethics is autonomous and situational, needing no theological or ideological sanction. And what a great lie that is. That I get why they get rid of theology, but notice what they're saying here. No ideological ways of understanding should be sanctioned as well. Their entire manifesto is ideology. As we've shown definitively, you go back to Marx, you go back through Hitler and through Stalin and through Lenin, you go back through the beginning of this movement. The whole thing is predicated exclusively on ideology and not in the least bit on anything on human experience. Ethics stems from human need and interest. To deny this distorts the whole basis of life. So you see how crudely material this is. Ethics is merely about what humans need and want, right? And if that's what ethics is, then where do you get the idea of sacrifice? Where do you get the idea of redeeming love? Where do you get the idea of loving thy neighbor more than yourself? No, it becomes purely almost instinctive and animalistic. Human life, it continues, has meaning only because we create and develop our own futures. Human life only has meaning because we give it meaning. Talk about a complete denial, epistemological denial of all truth, but then restating this in a purely ideological kind of truth, right? A purely narcissistic kind of truth. Finish that quote. Happiness and the creative realization of human needs and desires, individually and in shared enjoyment. How do you reconcile those two things? The history of world problems going back 5,000 years has been trying to figure a balance between individual and shared responsibilities. Now you're arguing basically that they're the same thing. These are continuous themes of humanism. We strive for the good life here and now. In other words, heaven on earth. We strive for the Garden of Eden here without any sacrifice, without any need for redemption, without any need for atonement. And that's why I mentioned a little bit earlier, why did these communists and socialists become such murderers? Because here you are in your own religious mind, you're handing these little proletariats, you're handing them heaven. Just become socialists. Just give us your freedom. Let us take care of you. Get rid of your liberty. Let us look after you from cradle to grave. You're offering them heaven on earth, and they want their own stubborn freedom. That's why you have to break a few eggs and shoot some of them in the head. Well, millions and millions and millions of them have to be shot in the head because they violate your religion that says we'll give you heaven on earth, and all you have to do is accept it at the cost of all of your freedom and liberty. And the fact that people won't go along is why there have been so many tens and well over 100 million dead in the wake of these socialist ideas. We round out segment 2 with a quote from that very astute observer of American values, Alexis de Tocqueville. Now, again, this is the beauty of this is that the socialist movement had not even really got going by the time de Tocqueville came over here and tried to understand America. It was in its nascency, right? You did not have any wide-scale socialist ideals while de Tocqueville was observing the American experience. Here's what de Tocqueville said, though, among one important thing among many about the American experiment. He said, democracy and socialism have nothing in common but one word, and that word is equality. Democracy, and I think by democracy he was talking about the American form of government, which really isn't a pure democracy. But notice the difference. While actual democracies seek equality in liberty, and certainly demos, democracy as understood by the ancient Greeks, does not seek equality and liberty. It's mob rule. He's talking about the qualified democracies of the West. But notice the difference. While democracies seek equality and liberty, socialism seeks equality in restraint and servitude. That's it. In our free market countries, in our constitutional republic, everybody is equally free in liberty. You can choose to succeed or you can choose to fail. You can choose to try or not. You can choose to change your careers midstream. You could completely transform your own life as an individual anytime you want to. Freedom of liberty is what free markets and free governments give you, right? Like constitutional republics. You are free in liberty. But to the socialist, you are equally free in restraint and servitude. Everybody will artificially be made equal by taking away anybody's liberty and freedom, right? This is the common and common core. We're not going to make you smarter. We're going to make you socially just in the schools, right? We're not going to worry about educating you because the more educated you are, the more you are better than somebody else. We're going to lower it all. Everybody will be equal in restraints by the bounds and the chains we put on them through government, and everyone will be equal as slaves.